Europeans discover the Americas, but they're not the first ones there. There are people. There are cultures. There are empires. There is a society that has been living here for thousands of years. We call them Native Americans, and there's plenty of them. Now, Europeans have been looking for a faster route to Asia, and they've heard rumors of an eastern seaboard that may lead to it. They send out Christopher Columbus. He sails across the Atlantic and lands in the Bahamas. He thinks he's in India, so he calls the natives Indians. And when he realizes he's actually somewhere else, he still doesn't know exactly where. He'll never find out. He dies believing he's in Asia. But he kicked off an invasion. Over the next couple of decades, Spanish, French, and English explorers will pour into the Caribbean, along the Gulf Coast and up the Atlantic coast looking for gold, God, and glory. But what they will find most of is opportunity, and soon enough, they'll start staying. In 1565, the Spanish established the oldest European settlement in what will become the United States, at least the one that survives. It's St. Augustine, Florida. But the English established their first colony in 1607 in a place they'll call Jamestown, Virginia. The Spanish had been there first, but their settlements don't last. So if you want to be first, you got to stay. And right away, the settlers face a struggle for survival. They arrive in the middle of summer, and they don't realize that the hot, humid weather is not just temporary. They're in a new place. They don't have the right clothes, the right food, and they start getting sick from diseases brought over from Europe. The Native Americans didn't have antibiotics, so many of the settlers die. Those that don't often wish they would. They quickly run out of food. There's not much to eat in this new world, or at least nothing they can figure out how to harvest. And without farming tools, they starve. The colonists had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know how to survive in the wilderness, and almost none of them had ever done any manual labor. Many of them die from things like bee stings or snake bites because they'd never seen a stinger or a fang before. But they did have one advantage. The Native Americans were more advanced than the Europeans in many ways, particularly in agriculture. They already knew what plants were safe to eat, which ones could help medicine, and even how to influence the growth of certain crops. They taught the colonists how to plant corn, beans, and squash, and that saved the colony from starvation. It takes years, but eventually the English colony stabilizes and starts growing. By 1620, the colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts, is booming. That is, of course, relative. This is New England, and it's winter. So by booming, we mean about 50 people survived out of a group of 102. But hey, that's progress, and the biggest reason for that is the Pilgrims had the right stuff. They were different from the earlier settlers. These were English Puritans who wanted to create a new kind of society, a pure society based on their version of Christianity. And that meant they had to be willing to leave everything behind. They gave up their old lives and sailed across the Atlantic for a chance at a new one. And the Mayflower wasn't some luxurious ship, not even close. It was a cramped, dirty boat with little room and little supplies. For 2 months, the Pilgrims lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions and ate mostly dried food that tasted terrible. Some passengers even had to sell their belongings to pay for food. And after 2 months, 45 of them died. But those who didn't were willing to do whatever it took to build their dream. They came up with rules for their colony, rules about how they would govern themselves, how they would treat each other, and how they would live. And they made sacrifices. They built homes and planted crops. They created a government and elected leaders. And they endured brutal winters and attacks from Native Americans. And you can criticize them for being religious fanatics or intolerant or racist, but you can't accuse them of not being brave. They left everything familiar behind. They crossed an ocean to get here. They faced incredible odds, and they built a new life from nothing. You can't take away their bravery. But while the Pilgrims struggled to build their society in New England, farther south in Virginia, another kind of struggle was taking place. The English colony at Jamestown was growing slowly. The land wasn't very fertile, so there wasn't much to grow. Most of the settlers were gentlemen adventurers. guys who didn't know how to work and had no intention of doing so. The colony was on the verge of collapse when John Smith took charge. He forced the settlers to work. He established a trading post and he negotiated with the Native Americans. He even fought alongside them against a common enemy, the Spanish. And under his leadership, the colony began to thrive. But Smith didn't realize how close he'd come to disaster. In 1609, he was injured in a gunpowder accident and he left for England to recover. As soon as he was well enough, he headed back to Virginia. But his ship went down in a storm, and he spent a night alone on an island. Then he was captured by the Spanish and spent 2 years in prison in Spain. When he finally returned to Virginia in 1613, he found that the colony had changed. The leadership was different. The settlers were different. But he also found that the colony was growing and thriving. The first representative government in North America had been established, and trade was booming. Jamestown had survived its early years, but nobody knew if it would last. A few years later, England would enter a civil war and its attention and resources would be diverted elsewhere. If the war lasted longer, the colony might have been abandoned. But the war ended in 1660 and King Charles II returned to power. He granted a charter to the Virginia Company, which had been running the colony, and made it a royal colony, meaning it would be directly controlled by the king. That meant more attention, more resources, and more settlers. By this point, the colony of Virginia was big enough and stable enough that England was willing to make it official. They sent over a governor and a council to run the colony. They established courts and a representative assembly, which became the first representative government in North America. They also started to focus on growing cash crops like tobacco. Tobacco was a huge hit in Europe, and it grew easily in Virginia. Soon, plantations were established all over the colony, and slavery was introduced to work those plantations. As the colonies grew, so did the conflict with the Native Americans. The settlers kept pushing west, and the Native Americans were not going to let that happen without a fight. So, in 1622, they attacked the English settlements. More than 300 settlers were killed. The English retaliated with brutal force. They burned Native American villages and killed hundreds. The Native Americans were never able to recover, and the English colonies kept expanding. As the 1600s wore on, more and more colonies were established along the Atlantic coast. The English established colonies in Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, and North Carolina. The French established colonies in Canada and the Caribbean. The Dutch established a colony in what would become New York. The Swedes established a small colony in Delaware. And each of these colonies was unique. They had different governments, different economies, different cultures. But they all had one thing in common. They were all trying to carve out an existence in a new land. They were all struggling to survive. This is the story of those struggles, the good times and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies. This is the story of the birth of America. Hey, I'm the host. If you liked this video, you'll probably like the series. Check it out. Also, I love doing these videos and I couldn't do them without the support of my patrons. If you want to support me too, go check it out. Okay, in order to understand how the United States got its start, you need to know about the period known as the birth of a nation, which is generally considered to be between the 1770s and the 1780s. And that period of time started with a war, not World War II, but the American Revolution. The American Revolution was a war between the American colonies and Great Britain. Why did these colonies go to war with their mother country? Well, they were tired of being told what to do by the British government. The problem was that Britain was trying to tell the colonies what to do even though they were not represented in Parliament. This lack of representation in the British government led to the famous quote, "No taxation without representation." The result was a war that lasted from 1775 to 1783 and resulted in the independence of the United States of America. Now, this war didn't just spring up out of nowhere. There were several key events that led up to the war, and let me tell you about one of them right now. It was called the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party took place on December 16, 1773. A group of colonists dressed up like Native Americans and snuck onto British ships docked in Boston Harbor and dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. They were protesting the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies. As a result of this protest, Britain passed the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, and those acts essentially punished the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The purpose of these acts was to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party, and they had four main parts. First, the Boston Harbor would remain closed until the colonists paid for the tea that was destroyed. Second, the Massachusetts Assembly could not meet unless the governor called the meeting. Third, British officials involved in the quarrel could be tried in England. And fourth, a military would be quartered in Boston to enforce these acts. Now, these acts inflamed the colonists and convinced them that Britain was trying to oppress them. So they met at the Continental Congress to figure out how to respond. Representatives from 12 colonies attended the meeting, and they organized a boycott of British goods. And now that I've reminded you about the Boston Tea Party and the Coercive Acts, let's return to the timeline. So, after the passage of the Coercive Acts, the colonists felt more united than ever before. In fact, in 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met together in the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to decide how to respond to the Intolerable Acts. They basically organized a boycott of British goods and asserted colonial rights to self-rule. The next year, 1775, fighting broke out between British troops and colonial militiamen at Lexington and Concord, and so began the American Revolution. The first shots of the war were fired on April 19, 1775 at Lexington and Concord. This event is known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord, or the shot heard round the world. From there, representatives from the colonies met up for the Second Continental Congress. And while they were meeting, a group of 56 men met in Philadelphia on May 1776 to draft a document declaring the colonies independent from Britain. Those men are known as the Founding Fathers, and what they created is known as the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was modeled after John Locke's philosophy and ideas found in his second treatise on civil government. Remember John Locke from Unit 2? Yeah, he's that English philosopher who had a huge influence on the Founding Fathers. Anyway, the Declaration of Independence outlined the reasons why the colonies were separating from Britain, and you can kind of think of it like a divorce decree. We're breaking up, and here's why. The document outlined the beliefs that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights that, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Founding Fathers argued that the purpose of government is to secure these rights, and that if the government fails to do that, then the people have the right to alter or abolish it. After the Declaration of Independence was signed, the colonies were officially known as the United States of America. The war for independence continued until 1783, and during that time, the Articles of Confederation governed the nation. The Articles of Confederation were adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777, and served as the first Constitution of the United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and the central government was very weak because it lacked the power to tax. Now, despite the fact that the Articles of Confederation had some major flaws, most of the states were happy with it initially because they feared a strong central government, and that fear was based on their experience with Britain. So what went wrong with the Articles of Confederation? Well, since the central government couldn't tax, it couldn't pay off the war debts incurred during the Revolutionary War. Also, the government couldn't regulate interstate commerce, which led to an economic mess between the states. Additionally, there was no national currency, no post office, and no national court system. Each state had its own currency and conducted its own foreign policy. The result was a hodgepodge of laws and regulations that made it difficult to do business between states. However, the central government did successfully avoid a major conflict with Britain over the Western territories. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War and recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. The United States extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But even though the United States had won its war for independence, the newly independent nation was facing major problems, and the solution to those problems required the revision of the Articles of Confederation. The first step toward revising the Articles of Confederation came in 1786, when delegates from 5 states met at the Annapolis Convention. The purpose of this meeting was to address interstate commerce, but only 2 states showed up, so nothing happened. However, that led to a larger convention the following year. In 1787, delegates from 12 states met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The main purpose of this convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but it quickly became clear that most of the delegates wanted to scrap it entirely. During the Constitutional Convention, there was a lot of debate about how to represent the states. Should representation be based on population, or should each state have an equal number of representatives? Well, the delegates ultimately decided to go with proportional representation, which meant that states with larger populations would have more representatives. That decision made smaller states afraid that they would be dominated by larger states, and that concern led to the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was proposed by Roger Sherman from Connecticut and solved the issue of representation by creating a bicameral legislature. One part of the legislature would be the Senate, where each state would get equal representation, 2 senators per state, and the other house would be the House of Representatives, where representation would be based on population. Once the issue of representation was settled, the rest of the Constitution fell into place. Other compromises had to be made along the way, such as the 3/5 Compromise, which dealt with how slaves would be counted for purposes of representation and taxation. Additionally, the delegates had to decide whether to include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Ultimately, they decided against it. However, the framers did agree to include a statement that would eventually lead to the addition of a Bill of Rights. That statement is known as the Elastic Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. So what does that mean? Well, the Elastic Clause gives Congress the power to make laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out the other powers granted to the federal government in the Constitution. In other words, if Congress determines that a law is necessary and proper for carrying out any of its enumerated powers, then it may pass that law even if the power is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So that's kind of like a little preview of what's to come later on in Unit 4. Anyway, once the Constitution was drafted, it had to be ratified. Ratifying the Constitution required approval by 9 states, and, as you can imagine, there were a few people who opposed the new Constitution. Those people were known as Anti-Federalists, and they were led by people like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams. The Federalists, on the other hand, were in favor of the new Constitution, and their arguments for ratification were presented in a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, and explained the reasons why the Constitution was a good thing. Anyway, after much debate and discussion, the Constitution was ratified, and the United States had a new governing document. Okay, so let's finish this video up by talking about why this period of time was so important. First of all, during this time period, the United States was born. The nation that we know today can trace its roots back to this era. Second, the ideals of the period are still relevant today. Ideas like liberty, equality, and democracy are still at the center of American politics. Third, the institutions created during this time period are still in existence. The Constitution and the government created under that Constitution have survived for more than 200 years. and that's a testament to the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. And finally, this period of time continues to inspire people around the world. The American Revolution was a truly revolutionary event. It was one of the first times that a colony had successfully revolted against its mother country. The success of the American Revolution has inspired people around the world to fight for their own freedom. All right, let's get to those early 1800s deets. Okay, so remember, at the end of the last video when I said that the United States was entering a period of good feelings? Well, we're going to spend this video talking about what that meant. Specifically, we're going to talk about how during this period known as the Era of Good Feelings, which lasted roughly from 1800 to 1830, the United States expanded its territory, grew its economy, and most importantly for our purposes established itself as a major player on the world stage. So if you are ready to test your wits on the young nation, then let's get to it. Okay, first up, let's start with the United States expanding its territory. And that's not a surprise because, as we talked about in the last video, one of the big characteristics of this time period is that American leaders believed in something called manifest destiny. Now, spoiler alert, manifest destiny is going to cause some serious problems down the road. But for now, let's see how it plays out. So, there are two main ways that the U.S. expanded its territory during this period. First, we bought some. And second, we took some. Okay, first, buying. In 1803, Napoleon offered to sell the United States this huge chunk of land west of the Mississippi River. And if you're looking at this map thinking, wait a minute, that's a lot of land. Well, then you are correct. That's because this purchase, which we call the Louisiana Purchase, doubled the size of the United States. And here's why Napoleon wanted to sell. Remember, he had big dreams of creating a huge empire in North America. And to do that, he needed to control the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. But then an anti-slavery rebellion in Haiti crippled his ability to manage the colony, and he just needed money to fund his other colonial projects. So he cut his losses and sold the entire region to the United States for $15 million. By the way, if you want to know more about how the Louisiana Purchase nearly didn't happen because of a misunderstanding over whether or not the U.S. could legally buy the land, click right here in the purple box. But once the deal was done, Americans began exploring the newly acquired territory, and many were blown away by the abundance of natural resources, fertile soil, and mild climate. And so, where did they go? Well, Oregon Country, also known as the Oregon Territory, was a region in the Pacific Northwest that was claimed by both the United States and Great Britain, but was largely controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company, a British monopoly that restricted American trade in the area. The problem was there was no clear legal way of determining who owned the region. But as more and more Americans migrated to the area, it became clear that the United States would either need to take military action to force the British out or find some other way to resolve the issue. Eventually, the U.S. settled on a compromise that drew the border between the two countries along the 49th parallel to the Rocky Mountains. And that's a lot of land, guys. So we can see that during this period, the United States expanded its territory through negotiation and compromise as well. Next up, taking. And when it comes to taking land, there's no better example than Texas. See, after Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, it opened up its vast territory to American settlers in hopes of increasing its population. But as more and more Americans moved to Texas, they began to feel like they had more in common with their neighbors to the north than the country they were living in. And it wasn't long before American settlers in Texas rebelled against the Mexican government and declared the area an independent republic. And although the U.S. didn't officially annex Texas until 1845, for all practical purposes, it was under the control of the United States. Now, soon after the Texas Revolution, the United States went to war with Mexico over the disputed territory of northern Mexico. And as a result of the U.S. victory in the Mexican War, the United States acquired vast territories in the Southwest, including California, Nevada, Utah, and yes, even parts of Texas. In fact, during this period, the United States acquired nearly half of the land it would eventually contain within its borders. Okay, next up, let's talk about how during this period, the United States began its journey toward industrialization. Now, before we can talk about that, let's begin with a quick review of agrarian life in the United States in the early 1800s. Now, despite the fact that the majority of Americans worked in agriculture, only about 25% of the population lived on farms. And that's because technological innovations such as the cotton gin increased the productivity of farming, meaning fewer people were needed to work the fields, and that led to a lot of rural folks moving into cities. Now, these cities weren't anything like the sprawling urban centers we know today. Even the largest city in the United States, New York City, didn't hit 1 million residents until 1860. But as more and more people moved into cities, they created new opportunities in commerce, manufacturing, and transportation, and that led to the beginnings of industrialization in the United States. And nowhere was that more evident than in the textile industry. For example, in 1793, a British inventor named Edmund Cartwright patented a power loom that mechanized the process of weaving cloth. Soon after, an American inventor named Francis Cabot Lowell adapted Cartwright's design and paired it with a spinning machine. The result was a faster, cheaper way to produce textiles, which in turn led to the opening of the first factory in the United States in 1809. Now, while the United States was slow to begin the Industrial Revolution compared to Great Britain, its proximity to waterways and abundance of natural resources made it ripe for industrial growth. For example, the first factories were powered by water power from fast-moving rivers in rural areas, and when those ran out, factories moved to places like Lowell, Massachusetts, where entrepreneurs built dams to harness power from fast-flowing rivers. And what that meant was that the United States was poised to enter the industrial age, which is great news for the U.S. and terrible news for any Native American nations standing in its way. Okay, finally, let's end this video by talking about how during this period, the United States demonstrated its strength against Great Britain in the War of 1812. Now, even though the War of 1812 ended in a draw, the United States showed the world that it could hold its own against the greatest military power in the world at the time. And that's exactly what happened when a group of British soldiers set fire to the nation's capital in 1814. But as the British prepared to invade Washington, D.C., a group of American women gathered up top-secret documents and important artifacts and hid them in a building close to the Capitol. When the British arrived, they found the building and demanded that the women hand over the documents. But you know what? They refused, earning them the title of the Heroines of 1814. And when the British learned that President James Madison had escaped capture, they decided to set fire to the White House and several other buildings before retreating. Now, even though the British burned down the White House, they ultimately failed to achieve any significant military victories in the war. In fact, in one of the most decisive battles of the war, a small group of American troops defeated a much larger British force at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. And that victory, along with news of Napoleon's defeat in Europe, created an unprecedented wave of patriotism across the United States. So, in terms of a motivational angle, we can say that during this period, Americans were willing to take risks and leave their homeland in search of opportunity, whether that meant traveling to the Oregon Territory or moving to Texas, or heading to a growing industrial center like Lowell, Massachusetts. And that willingness to take risks set the stage for future economic growth and expansion throughout the United States. All right, let's get those brain cells melted and divided over slavery once again. Okay, so the period from 1865 to 1877 is called the Reconstruction era. But before we can understand how the South was reconstructed, we have to understand what caused this reconstruction in the first place. And that, my friends, has to do with the Civil War, which we began in the last video. So if you haven't already watched that video, go watch it now. Okay, now that we're back, let's finish talking about the Civil War and then move on to the Reconstruction era. Now, as we talked about in the last video, The Civil War was fought primarily over the issue of slavery. In the South, slavery was a way of life, and many Southerners believed that it was ordained by God Himself. Meanwhile, as we also discussed, abolitionists in the North were working to end slavery on moral grounds, believing that all men are created equal and thus no one has the right to own another human being. And the disagreement over whether or not slavery should exist caused an even bigger disagreement over whether or not states had the right to secede from the Union. And when Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election in 1860, promising to keep slavery out of new territories, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. And then 4 more states left the Union after Lincoln was inaugurated. And then the Civil War began. And although it would be a vast oversimplification to say that slavery was the only cause of the war, it was certainly one of the biggest factors that led to the secession crisis and ultimately the war itself. Now, Lincoln was against slavery, but when the war began, he did not want to end slavery. That would have alienated many of the border states who had slavery but remained in the Union. And besides, ending slavery was not really in the cards strategically. And Lincoln knew this because in 1863, he tried to get Congress to pass an amendment that would abolish slavery, but it failed. It wasn't until January of 1865 that the 13th Amendment was passed, outlawing slavery throughout the United States. Meanwhile, as the war dragged on, the issue of slavery became more and more important. In fact, in 1862, Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate states would be freed as of January 1, 1863. And then in September of 1864, Lincoln issued the Final Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in areas still in rebellion against the United States shall be then, henceforward, and forever free. Now, the most important thing to understand about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it only applied to slaves in Confederate territory, not in border states where slavery was still legal. And it was not meant to apply to areas of the South that had been occupied by the Union Army. By the time the preliminary proclamation was issued in 1862, most of the Confederacy was in the hands of the Union Army, which meant that the proclamation didn't actually free that many slaves. But it did set the tone for the rest of the war, making clear that ending slavery was a major goal of the Union cause, and it also gave former slaves in the South a reason to escape to Union lines. In fact, over 100,000 formerly enslaved people did just that during the last 2 years of the war, escaping to Union lines and becoming what was known as contraband. The Union Army didn't know what to do with them at first, but eventually they set up camps to house these refugees. Anyway, in 1865, the Civil War came to an end with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April and the fall of the Confederacy in May. The war had been devastating for both the North and the South. The economy and infrastructure of the South was basically destroyed, and there was a severe labor shortage since most of the able-bodied white men had been killed in the war. And to make matters worse, the federal government pulled most of the funding it had been sending to the South before the war, such as funding for internal improvements, meaning that states like Georgia and South Carolina went from having the best infrastructure in the nation to having practically none. It was bad. So now here comes the question. How do you rebuild a region and an economy that has been literally destroyed by war? And how do you integrate 4 million former slaves into a society that has been structured around slavery? These were the challenges facing the nation at the beginning of the Reconstruction era in 1865. Now, to answer these questions, we need to talk about how the federal government divided the South. In 1865, President Lincoln created a military district system in the South, placing the entire region under the control of the military. This was done with the help of General Ulysses S. Grant, who oversaw the creation of 5 military districts in the South. And these 5 military districts were then each overseen by a military governor, such as General John M. Schofield, who oversaw the 1st Military District, which included parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And these military governors were given the power to oversee the transition from military rule to civilian rule, as well as to oversee the writing of new state constitutions and the admission of former Confederate states back into the Union. And the process for readmitting a state into the Union was outlined in a series of congressional acts starting with the first Military District Act of 1865. The main requirements for readmission outlined in this act were 1. The formation of a new state constitution, 2. The adoption of an oath of loyalty to the United States, 3. The guarantee of the right to vote for all male inhabitants of the state, including formerly enslaved people, 4. The repudiation of the Confederate debt, and 5. The submission of the new Constitution to the President for his approval. And if a state met all of these requirements, then they could be readmitted to the Union. Now, it's important to understand that while the military districts were meant to be temporary, they ended up lasting for over a decade. Also, readmission was not automatic, and states had to be approved by Congress. And this process was often slow and difficult, especially for states like Mississippi and Louisiana, which were held up because of disputes over representation. For example, in 1869, Mississippi was admitted to the Union with 2 senators and 2 representatives, even though the state's constitution denied suffrage to most African Americans. And then a similar thing happened in Louisiana in 1868, except their new constitution denied suffrage to anyone who had voted for a Confederate candidate in any election. But despite these setbacks, by 1870, all the former Confederate states except Texas had been readmitted to the Union. Meanwhile, during this same time period, the 14th Amendment was passed, guaranteeing equal protection of the laws to all persons born in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. And the 15th Amendment was also passed, guaranteeing the right to vote to all male citizens of the United States, regardless of race. But unfortunately, these amendments were not always respected in the South, and although it was illegal to deny someone the right to vote based on their race in practice, many Southern states found ways around this amendment through things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and the outright intimidation and violence used against African American voters. And this is something we will talk more about in the next video. Alright, now let's think about why this period was so important. First of all, the period immediately following the Civil War was a time of great upheaval and change in the South. The institution of slavery was abolished, and millions of African Americans were suddenly free. And this caused a lot of social, political, and economic changes in the South, which we'll explore more in future videos. Second, the period was also a time of great rebuilding. The South had been devastated by the Civil War, and it needed to be rebuilt from scratch. And this led to a lot of new opportunities for people in the region. For example, new businesses and industries were started, and new jobs were created. Third, the period was also a time of great tension and conflict between the North and the South. The two regions had very different views on how to deal with the issues of race and civil rights, and this led to a lot of debate and fighting. For example, the issue of slavery was still a major point of contention, and the two regions could not agree on how to deal with it. And fourth, the period was also a time of great hope and possibility. Many people in the South believed that the war had brought about a new era of equality and justice for African Americans, and they worked hard to make that vision a reality. For example, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments was a major step forward for civil rights, and in this video, we're going to look at how the United States went from a rural, mostly agrarian country to an industrial powerhouse in just about 50 years. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, before we get started, I need to tell you that this is not a sponsored video by Snickers, but like, wow. It would be a perfect time for them to jump in here and say, "Hey, welcome to my history class." Because I'm so glad you came. It is a great time. It is a super fun time. But also because it would really help me out if you hit those like and subscribe buttons down below. It would make my day. Alright, now let's get to the good stuff. So in order to understand what happens in this period, you gotta know the Industrial Revolution is happening. And if you don't remember what that was, you can click right over here and go back and watch that video. But basically, what it was is a revolution in manufacturing spurred by new inventions like the cotton gin and later the power loom. And in Europe, the effects of these new inventions were immediate. But here in the United States, our agrarian economy didn't really change much until after the Civil War. And part of the reason for that is that all of the resources needed to kickstart the Industrial Revolution, like coal and iron, were located in Britain. So Britain got the ball rolling. They became the first major country to move into industrialization. Then, once other countries began to catch up, like Germany and France and the United States, they did so by taking raw materials from their colonies. So the United States got a little bit of a head start. And then, when that head start wore off, we were pretty much screwed. So by the 1870s, European nations had gobbled up most of the world's supply of raw materials. And if you want something that you can't have, you should probably just steal it. And that's exactly what they did. So there was an explosion of American industry in the late 1800s. This period is sometimes called the Second Industrial Revolution, and it was marked by the expansion of railroads, steel production, electricity, and more. Now, in addition to the massive amounts of raw materials that Europeans had stolen from their colonies, several factors contributed to this explosion of industry. First, there were all those immigrants that were washing up on our shores. You'll see this big spike in immigration here. These people are coming through Ellis Island, and that's a whole other video. But the point is, they're coming here for jobs. They're leaving places like Ireland and Germany and China and Italy, places where conditions were rough, where there was widespread poverty, and they're coming here because they think America's going to be better. Now, second, the United States had abundant resources. We weren't so worried about where we got our raw materials because we had plenty of coal and oil and iron and lumber here. And third, we had the legal and political infrastructure necessary to support business. You know, with the introduction of laissez-faire economics, which is an economic philosophy that says the government shouldn't interfere in the economy. That's a whole other video too. But basically what that means is that we don't have kings or queens or emperors owning everything in sight. In America, we have this property that is protected by the rule of law. So people are free to own businesses and do whatever they want with them. Like you can start a business in your jammies if you want. I mean, provided you meet certain requirements, but still, that's pretty cool. Anyway, all these things combined led to this incredible explosion of American industry. And the way that happened was that Americans began investing in factories and building these massive industrial complexes that churned out all sorts of consumer goods. Now, these included things like textiles, food processing equipment, steel products, all sorts of things, and the result was that the United States went from being an agricultural economy to an industrial one practically overnight. And so now we have all these cities. And cities are nothing new. We've had cities since colonial times. But these industrial cities were different. They were different because they housed hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit. These cities became hives of industry and immigration. Now, life in these industrial cities was not great. There were terrible sanitation problems and widespread poverty. The wealth that these industrialists were creating was not distributed evenly among the population. It was hoarded by the few. But nevertheless, the American dream was born in this period. And that's this idea that if you work hard, you can become wealthy. And despite the fact that it's not really true, it still sort of is because we still live in a capitalist society, and if you work hard and play your cards right, you can become wealthy. Now, the last thing I want to mention in this video is that it was during this period that the United States went from being this rather small agrarian nation to being a global superpower. And that's a huge deal. I mean, look at it. Look at the size of this country. It's huge. And if you remember at the beginning of the course, we were this tiny little island over here. Anyway, that transformation will be the focus of the next video. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 4, and I'm glad we got to hang out for a few minutes, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. I'm out. Okay, I know that was a lot. Let's make sure that we can remember it by doing a quick review. First of all, there was the Second Industrial Revolution, and that was this explosion of American industry that happened between the 1870s and the 1900s. The main features of it were railroads, steel production, and electricity. All these things kind of happened at once, and there were three factors that contributed to this explosion of industry. Number one, there were lots of immigrants coming to America. They were looking for jobs and they found them. Number two, there were abundant natural resources. We had lots of coal and iron and oil and timber, and number three, there was the legal and political climate that was friendly to business. We had laissez-faire economics and the rule of law. So all those things combined resulted in the Second Industrial Revolution. And the other major feature of this period was rapid urbanization. People were moving to cities in droves, and they were living in these very crowded industrial cities that were not well equipped to deal with all of the people who were moving there. Also, this was the period in which the American dream began. And that's this idea that if you work hard, you can become wealthy. And to be honest, it's not entirely true, but it sort of is, because we do live in a capitalist society. If you work hard, you can become wealthy. And finally, during this period, the United States grew from this rather small agrarian nation to this massive industrial powerhouse. And that's kind of a big deal. Well, it's been an amazing journey to learn about America in the 1900s. And we've covered so much history. In order to prepare for the AP exam, let's finish this journey by looking at how America's role in the world was transformed during this era. So, if you're ready to get them brain cells milked interstate commerce regulation style, then let's get to it. Okay, first up, let's talk about World War I, which is right up there at the tippy top of your outline. So, we know that before World War I, America's foreign policy was largely isolationist with a dash of good neighborliness thrown in for good measure. But as the war in Europe raged on, things began to change. And we can see that most clearly through the actions of President Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson wanted to keep the United States out of the conflict, but he did intervene over in Europe on two occasions. First, he mediated peace negotiations between the warring powers in an effort to bring the fighting to an end. And then, second, he intervened in the conflict to protect American interests after several key events. First, the British and French came under attack from Germany and unrestricted submarine warfare. Second, the Germans sank the Lusitania in 1915, killing over 100 Americans. Third, they intercepted the Zimmermann telegram in early 1917, which proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico in order to fight the United States. And finally, the German resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, which threatened American shipping and trade. Now, all these events pushed the American public opinion toward interventionism, and so Wilson went to Congress in early 1917 and asked them to declare war on Germany. That action, my friends, is what transformed the United States into a truly global power. And the reason for that is simple. By joining the conflict, the U.S. added industrial and economic might on the side of the Allies. With that, the financial resources of the United States allowed the Allies to continue fighting even after their own economies were devastated by years of war. And the massive influx of American troops into Europe bolstered the ranks of the weary soldiers who had been fighting since 1914. Now, with the entry of the United States into World War I, the fighting quickly ended and the war was over. And then peace negotiations took place at the Paris Peace Conference, where Wilson pushed for the creation of the League of Nations. Unfortunately, the U.S. Senate rejected American participation in the League of Nations, which meant that the United States was not a signatory to the Treaty of Versailles. And that brings us to our second major event, which is the Great Depression. Now, while this occurred in the 1920s, the effects of the Depression lasted all the way until the U.S. entered World War II in 1941. And so it's important that we look at here because it demonstrates the resiliency of the American people. So the causes of the Great Depression are varied and complex, but they all basically boil down to one thing: over-speculation and overproduction. What that means is that during the 1920s, many Americans invested heavily in the stock market in the belief that prices would continue to rise. But that turned out to be a false assumption because the prices fell. Prices fell dramatically in October of 1929, which led to panic selling and ultimately to the worst economic downturn in American history. As a result of that, international trade declined, unemployment skyrocketed, and Americans lost faith in the capitalist economic system. Now, in response to the crisis, President Herbert Hoover took a hands-off approach, believing that the economy would correct itself if the government just stayed out of it. But that didn't happen. And so when his successor, Franklin Roosevelt, took office, he responded with the New Deal, which was a series of government programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform for the American people. These programs included the Social Security Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the Works Progress Administration, which employed millions of Americans and put them to work building infrastructure across the country. Now, despite the fact that the Great Depression caused immense suffering for Americans, it also taught some important lessons. First, it showed that the American economy was deeply interconnected with the rest of the world. If other countries suffered economically, then the U.S. would suffer too. Second, it demonstrated the limitations of laissez-faire economic policies and led to the expansion of the federal government's role in the economy. Finally, the New Deal ushered in an era of reform that left a lasting legacy on the American political landscape. And speaking of the Great Depression, if you need more help learning about this and other topics, then click right over here and grab a review packet. It's got everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. Okay, now let's finish our journey with the third item on the World War II and the entry of the United States into the war. So, to understand America's entry into World War II, it's imperative that you know what happened at Pearl Harbor. So, on December 7, 1941, Japanese fighter planes launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Japanese objective was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and buy them time to capture the surrounding territories in Southeast Asia. Well, they accomplished the first part of their objective, but not the second. And that was due to the fact that the Japanese admiral in charge made a critical error. He failed to destroy the aircraft carriers of the U.S. fleet, which were out at sea when the attack occurred. Now, in response to the attack, President Franklin Roosevelt called for a declaration of war against Japan, which Congress did on December 8th. And with that, the United States was off to the races. Within 3 days, American pilots were engaging Japanese forces in the Philippines and the Pacific. And within a year, American troops had landed in North Africa to begin the long campaign to push the Axis powers out of the Mediterranean. Now, the war in Europe and the Pacific would rage on for another 3 years, but the outcome was never really in doubt once the United States was involved. And that's simply because no nation on earth could compete with the sheer economic and industrial might of the United States. And so the United States would go on to win the war, defeat the Axis powers, and establish its dominance on the global stage. And the story of America in the 1900s has come to an end. Well, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here every step of the way as we continue our journey through American history. Until then, I'm out. Okay, I have one more thought that I want to leave you with on this video, and it's this. Imagine if the United States had not emerged victorious in World War I, or if the Great Depression had caused such widespread devastation that the American people had lost faith in democracy, or if the attack on Pearl Harbor had somehow been successful in crippling the American Pacific Fleet. In each of those instances, American history would have taken a drastically different turn, and so would the history of the entire world. But that's not what happened. The United States emerged from each of those crises stronger than ever before, and that's something that we should all strive for in our own lives. Life is full of ups and downs, successes and failures, but it's what we do in the face of adversity that truly matters. Do we let the challenges of life defeat us, or do we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and come back even stronger than before? I hope that you choose the latter, and I know that you can do it. You just need to believe in yourself and have the courage to take risks, to try new things, and to persevere in the face of difficulty. Okay, first things first, what was the Cold War era? Well, it was that time between 1945 and the 1990s when the United States and its allies went head-to-head with the USSR and its allies in a high-stakes game of nuclear chicken. Now, that might sound dramatic, and it is. But basically, after World War II, the United States and the USSR emerged as the world's superpowers, and they spent a lot of time threatening each other with mutually assured destruction. So, what kept the whole thing from devolving into World War III? Well, partially, it was the fact that both sides had the means to annihilate the other side several times over, and also the fact that neither side wanted to be seen as inferior to the other. It was like this big contest to see who could do what better, and it had a profound impact on American life, which we're going to talk about right now. Now, before we get into the space race, let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement because that was another major development during the Cold War era. And it's especially relevant for this video because the two things are related. So here's the deal. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists began a movement to end racial segregation and discrimination in the American South and eventually across the country. And it wasn't easy. There was a lot of resistance and sometimes violence, but eventually they won significant legal and political victories, including the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, why does this matter? Well, because the United States had been fighting the good fight against racism for a long time, but it really picked up steam during the Cold War. And here's why. See, the United States liked to think of itself as a beacon of freedom and democracy. But at the same time, it was still very much a segregated society. And that wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was also bad for America's image on the world stage. So, in order to make its claims of freedom and democracy more credible, the United States began to invest heavily in the civil rights movement. President Kennedy, for example, created the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, which aimed to end discrimination in the workplace. And in 1963, he addressed the nation on the need for equal rights for African Americans. After Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson took these efforts even further, passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. These were landmark achievements that helped to create a more just and equal society. But they also had a profound impact on American culture. The Civil Rights Movement was one of the most important social movements in American history, and it was made possible by the efforts of countless individuals who dared to dream of a better world. And speaking of dreaming of a better world, let's go ahead and talk about the economic boom and pop culture of this era. The post-World War II era saw an unprecedented economic boom in the United States. The war had devastated much of Europe and Asia, but the U.S. had emerged relatively unscathed and well-positioned to take advantage of the growing global economy. Several factors contributed to this boom. First, the U.S. had invested heavily in science and technology during the war, which led to the development of new products and industries. For example, the development of the atomic bomb had led to the creation of the nuclear power industry. Second, the U.S. had a large and growing population, which provided a big domestic market for new products. Finally, the U.S. government played an active role in promoting economic growth through policies such as the GI Bill, which provided financial aid to veterans to help them buy homes and start businesses. All of these factors combined to create an economic boom that lasted for several decades. During this time, the U.S. became the dominant economic power in the world, and Americans enjoyed a higher standard of living than ever before. This economic boom had a profound impact on American life. It led to the creation of new jobs, new industries, and new products. It also led to the growth of the middle class and an overall improvement in the quality of life for most Americans. The economic boom of the post-World War II era was one of the most significant developments in American history. It laid the foundation for the United States to become the dominant economic power in the world and set the stage for decades of prosperity. Okay, now let's talk about pop culture. Pop culture was huge during the Cold War era, and it was a reflection of the optimism and exuberance of the time. Music, film, and television all played a big part in shaping the culture of the era. For example, the 1950s and 60s saw the rise of rock and roll, which was a new genre of music that was born out of the fusion of blues, country, and gospel music. Elvis Presley was one of the first and most famous rock and roll stars, and his energetic performances and suggestive dance moves were seen as a threat to the conservative values of the time. But rock and roll soon became a staple of American pop culture, and it continues to be popular today. Another important aspect of pop culture during the Cold War era was the rise of Hollywood films. Movies like Rebel Without a Cause and Breakfast at Tiffany has captured the angst and alienation of a generation of young Americans. Meanwhile, TV shows like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits explored the darker side of human nature in a world dominated by technology and the military-industrial complex. Overall, pop culture during the Cold War era was a reflection of the anxieties and uncertainties of the time, but it was also a celebration of American ingenuity, freedom, and optimism. All right, let's talk about that motivational angle because this is an AP government video after all. And that means we have to talk about how this era motivated people to be their best selves. The Cold War era was a time of great challenges and tensions, but it was also a time of great innovation and achievement. The rivalry between the United States and the USSR motivated people to push the boundaries of what was possible. Here's a few examples. First, the space race. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 by the USSR shocked the United States and led to a massive investment in science and technology. This resulted in the creation of NASA and the launching of the first American astronaut into orbit in 1962. This competition led to incredible advancements in science and technology. Then consider the development of the interstate highway system. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Highway Act, which allocated billions of dollars for the construction of a nationwide network of superhighways. This was in response to the growing mobility of the American public and the need to move troops quickly in the event of a national emergency. The result was a transportation revolution that transformed the way Americans travel and do business. Not to mention the development of nuclear energy. The threat posed by the USSR and the potential for nuclear war led to a massive investment in nuclear research. This resulted in the development of nuclear power plants that provide electricity to millions of homes and businesses today. Lastly, consider the development of new weapons systems. The arms race between the United States and the USSR led to the development of some of the most sophisticated weapons ever created. This included the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, and sophisticated aircraft. The Cold War era was a time of great challenges, but it was also a time of great opportunity. The competition with the USSR motivated people to push the boundaries of what was possible and to strive for excellence. People stood up for freedom, equality, and democracy. They pushed for civil rights and social justice. They worked to protect the environment and advance the cause of peace. These people were not afraid to stand up for what they believed in, even in the face of great challenges. They were motivated by a deep sense of purpose and a desire to make the world a better place. And just like that, the curtain fell on the Cold War. As the dust settled in the early 1990s, the United States found itself in a position it hadn't occupied before. The world is sole superpower. This wasn't a title won on a battlefield, but a new reality shaped by decades of ideological struggle. The world looked on, wondering, what's next? The answer, as it turned out, would redefine not just America, but the entire globe. This new era wasn't just about geopolitics, it was about something far more personal, something that would soon be in our homes, on our desks, and eventually in the palms of our hands. I'm talking about the tech revolution. While the seeds were planted earlier, the 90s saw them explode into a forest of innovation. From a garage in California, Apple was already reimagining personal computing. In a dorm room, the idea for what would become Google was taking shape, promising to organize the world's information. Microsoft was on a mission to put a computer on every desk and in every home. These weren't just companies. They were the architects of our modern digital world. Think about it for a moment. How did you get your news this morning? How did you connect with friends last night? How are you even watching this video right now? The odds are high that the answer lies with the innovations that blossomed during this incredible period. The dot-com boom, and even its eventual bust, fundamentally changed how we communicate, work, learn, and live. It was a whirlwind of dial-up tones giving way to broadband speeds, of encyclopedias gathering dust as search engines rose to prominence. This wasn't just progress, it was a complete paradigm shift, a digital leap of faith that propelled society into the 21st century. The spirit of innovation didn't stop with software and the internet. It was about pushing the boundaries of what was possible. A new player, Tesla, would later emerge, challenging the century-old dominance of the internal combustion engine and daring us to imagine a future powered by sustainable energy. This relentless drive to invent, to improve, to disrupt the status quo became a defining characteristic of this new American chapter. It was a testament to the idea that a single person with a bold idea could, quite literally, change the world. It was an era of dreamers, builders, and code writers who were crafting the future, one line of code, one patent, one breakthrough at a time. But as the new millennium dawned, full of technological optimism and promise, the nation was about to be tested in a way no one could have ever imagined. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. That morning, the clear blue sky was pierced by an act of unimaginable tragedy. The attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the downed flight in Pennsylvania didn't just topple buildings, they shook the very foundation of the nation's sense of security. It was a moment of profound shock and deep, collective grief. In an instant, the world felt different, more fragile, more uncertain. In the hours and days that followed, however, something remarkable happened. Amidst the sorrow and the smoke, a different kind of spirit emerged. It was the spirit of resilience. We saw firefighters and first responders running into danger while others ran out. We saw strangers helping strangers, communities coming together, and a nation uniting in shared heartbreak and resolve. The images of courage and compassion from that day are as seared into our collective memory as the images of destruction. This tragedy revealed a deep well of strength and unity that had perhaps been taken for granted. It showed that while America could be wounded, its spirit could not be broken. The aftermath of 9/11 would shape American foreign policy, domestic security, and the national conversation for years to come. It led to long and complex conflicts abroad and sparked intense debates at home about security versus liberty. But the story of that day is not just one of loss. It is also a powerful story of human resilience, a testament to the ability to stand back up after being knocked down, to rebuild not just with steel and concrete, but with hope and determination. It was a painful, defining moment that reminded everyone of the preciousness of peace and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. As we move closer to the present day, it's clear that the journey hasn't gotten any easier. America today is a complex tapestry woven with threads of incredible progress and significant challenges. We are grappling with deep political divisions that often make it feel like we're living in two different countries. The economy, while capable of incredible growth, also reveals stark inequalities and anxieties about the future of work. Social issues, from civil rights to identity, are at the forefront of the national conversation, forcing a continuous and often difficult re-examination of our values and who we are as a people. These aren't simple problems with easy solutions. They are the growing pains of a dynamic, ever-changing society. They are the debates that free people have. The beauty of the American experiment and its greatest challenge is that it's never finished. It's a constant work in progress. It's a conversation, an argument, a struggle, and a collaboration that has been going on for over 2 centuries. And every single generation is called upon to pick up the mantle and carry it forward, to confront the challenges of their time with courage and conviction. And that brings us to the heart of the matter, to the core motivational truth of this entire journey. From those first uncertain steps onto a new continent to the complexities of our digital age, the story of America has never been one of perfection. It's a story filled with triumphs and tragedies, with moments of incredible unity and periods of painful division. It's a human story, with all the flaws and glories that entails. But the one constant, the one through line, is the relentless striving. The striving to be better, to live up to those lofty ideals of liberty and justice, to form a more perfect union. This journey is ongoing. It's happening right now, in our communities, in our debates, in our aspirations for our children. The story isn't over. We are all writing the next chapter. The challenges are real, but so is the resilience. The divisions are deep, but so is the capacity for connection. The American story reminds us that progress is not a straight line, but a determined, often difficult climb. It's a testament to the idea that even when we stumble, the goal is to always get back up and continue the journey. Always striving, never perfect, but always pushing forward. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through history. It's been a privilege to explore these stories with you. If you've enjoyed this series and want to see more content like it, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us continue to create these explorations. We'll see you in the next one.